You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. This is the Edge of the World.
This is Whitley Strieber, and this is Dreamland. You have reached the edge of the world. Today, we're talking to Nick Redfern about a very unusual topic. We think of Nick in terms of UFO investigations, but he goes way beyond that. The pyramids and the Pentagon. Did you know that the Pentagon does a great deal of mostly quite secret research into our lost past? That's right. That's right. They're as interested in it as we are. You'll remember Linda Moulton Howe's strange report on the mystery of Oltesis and that book that we could never find, that had been removed from the libraries by somebody, about ancient Greek gods, and perhaps a truth that someone does not want us to know. Then, for subscribers, Nick and I are going to be talking about top secret places, high security facilities, underground bases, and other off-limits areas that the government does not want us to know about. We're going to go way beyond Area 51. There is an awful lot hidden all around us. You know, Rich Dolan talks about a breakaway civilization. We're going to be talking today in both Dreamland and the subscriber area about some of the visible edges of that breakaway civilization that are all around us. So get set, as I often say, it's gonna be a bumpy ride today. Nick Redfern, welcome to Dreamland.
Well, thanks, Whitley.
Nick, I want to start in the past because on Dreamland, we often talk about this issue of a lost past. And most of us, I think, are pretty well convinced that something different happened here in the distant past than we have been led to believe. Your book certainly suggests that. And I'd like to talk about your views about what happened. In the chapter, Ancient Atomic Annihilation, you have some really very interesting views about this. Could you tell us, go back, if you will, to the Mahabharata and that 18-day war?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is sort of, one of those stories that almost sounds too good to be true until you realize it actually is true. I think you're quite right. I think everybody has almost like that subconscious knowledge, sort of an inherited memory almost on the tip of our tongue that there were sort of fantastic civilizations in the past, and stories of floods and massive cataclysms kind of resonate with us, with everybody, I think, but we don't really know why. And I think it is possibly, some sort of inherited memory of times long gone when there were highly advanced civilizations. And I think there's no sort of better example of this than the Mahabharata, along with that, the Ramayana, two very ancient and famous Sanskrit texts from India that basically chronicle the history of this sort of turbulent war between two particular warring factions in ancient India. Now, the dating of the Mahabharata is kind of controversial. I mean, conservative estimates consider it sort of 6,000 to 7,000 BC, thereabouts. Other people have suggested that particular version may be based upon an even older and far more ancient text, talking about tens of thousands of years, possibly even in the past, which of course would inevitably sort of rewrite modern day history, as we perceive it at least. But, you would imagine that an ancient text like this, talking about battles between two warring factions in India, you know, you would have this imagery of sort of bows and arrows, shields, spears, you know, soldiers fighting on horseback, etc. But the Mahabharata tells an extremely different story. It basically talks about this, as you pointed out, an 18-day long campaign, basically, called the Kurukshetra War. And basically it talks about these high-flying aircraft, for want of a better term, known as Vimanas. And the description of them, you know, they don't even sound like rudimentary gliders. They sound, for all the world, like Top Gun fighter planes that were equipped with devastating weaponry, these sort of iron rods that they would aim at cities, and, you know, there would be this terrible blast, you know, like an overwhelming, blinding flash that would cover the entire landscape. You know, the ground would shake, and there would be this huge plume of smoke rise literally miles into the sky, and would also blot out the sun, and drop the temperatures. And on top of that, there are stories about the troops in the hours and days afterwards falling sick, falling ill, and dying, and throwing themselves into rivers to try and cleanse themselves. Now, of course, when you put all this together, sort of high-flying, fast-maneuvering aircraft, firing these iron rods and these huge, tumultuous explosions, the sky going dark, and people dying in the immediate aftermath from sickness, this all sounds like a very ancient version, if you like, or legend of somebody describing in their own terms an ancient nuclear war. You know, even down to the sky darkening and the ground and the environment growing cold. That ties in with the whole nuclear winter scenario that scientists postulate could happen in, you know, like a worldwide nuclear confrontation. And what's more intriguing is that one person who was very much not just interested, but I would say almost obsessed with the Mahabharata was none other than Robert Oppenheimer, without doubt, you know, the ultimate brains behind the atomic bomb. And he took to quoting from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana on many occasions, and he actually came to regret the day that, you know, he worked on and pretty much developed the atomic bomb. And there's a little footnote to this, that in 1952 he was involved in a seminar in Washington, D.C., and in the question and answer session he was asked if the 3 atomic bombs that had been exploded, that was the first one at the Trinity site in New Mexico, which was the first test of an atomic weapon, and then the 2 dropped on Japan. And he was asked, were they the first? And he said, yes, they were, but then he paused for a moment and said, and then added, in modern times, as if to suggest, you know, that, yes, this was the first time we'd exploded atomic weapons. But his statements, when you consider it alongside the fact that he had this obsession with the Mahabharata, it's almost as if he was trying to tell us a little truth and a little secret that he may have been exposed to without actually kind of compromising the secrecy oaths, if you like.
From the Mahabharata, quoted in the pyramids and the Pentagon, Gurkha, flying in his swift and powerful Vimana, hurled against the 3 cities of the Varishnis and Andhadakas a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, an incandescent column of smoke and fire, as brilliant as 10,000 suns, rose in all its splendor. It was the unknown weapon, the iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death. Now, it mentions this Vimana aircraft, Nick.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a little bit about what that might have been, and could it have worked? And has there been anybody who has experimented with this in the present time?
Well, actually, no, that's a very good question, Whitley, because, you know, the objects themselves, you know, the way they sort of storm around the sky, which is probably a very good way to put it, you know, they do sound like highly maneuverable, fast-moving aircraft. You know, there's been speculation that, you know, perhaps some sort of manned flight with balloons, you know, goes back far earlier than we realize. But we're not even talking about that. We're talking about what sound like advanced technology, you know, zipping around the skies of India at high speed and being able to performing incredible maneuvers, etc., in a fashion that, you know, you would see today, I guess, you know, in the Middle East, so to speak. I mean, I'll give you an example. just one particular quote that I refer to in the book, which comes from a Colonel Henry S. Olcott. He said, "The ancient Hindus could navigate the air, and not only navigate it, but fight battles in it like so many war eagles combating for the domination of the clouds. To be so perfect in aeronautics, they must have known all the arts and sciences related to and including the strata and currents of the atmosphere, the relative temperature, humidity, density, and specific gravity of the various gases." Now, that was written in 1881, so there's been a lot of research for many years into the Vimanas, but they were basically described as being very strong, durable, light, and powered by an engine of mercury. That in itself, suggests some highly advanced device. It sounds more akin to something far more advanced than what we're flying today, even, I think it's fair to say.
Now, what about the remarkable story of Henry Monteith and Sandia Laboratories?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean...
you know what we're going to have to do, though? We're going to have to take a break before you tell it. We'll be right back, folks. Today, we're talking to Nick Redfern, his website, nickredfern.com, his terrific new books, Top Secret, The Pyramids and the Pentagon, and Keep Out, Top Secret Places Governments Don't Want You to Know About. Nick, just before we left the air, I was getting ready to ask you about Monteith, Henry Monteith at Sandia Laboratories. Could you tell us a little bit about what he may have found regarding Vimana aircraft?
Yeah, sure. This comes from a researcher named Richard Wingate, who's delved deeply into a lot of ancient mysteries and, the idea that highly advanced cultures existed beyond ours or before ours. And Henry Monteith worked at a place in New Mexico called the Sandia Labs, which undertakes, a lot of classified work for the government. And on the matter of Vimanas, the idea that they were powered by a mercury-type engine, Monteith noted that mercury, when it's in like a gasified form, actually makes for a very good propellant. It's a highly durable and efficient propellant. And Richard Wingate, when he heard what Monteith had to say about this, asked him outright, is it possible that the Vimanas are still being constructed today, part of possibly some sort of classified military program or something like that? And when he posed that question to Monteith didn't actually deny it, but as Wingate said, he preferred not to answer the question. And what's interesting is Henry Monteith also had a deep interest in cattle mutilations and also wrote a number of books and, as somebody who's deeply interested in, various paranormal enigmas, if you like. So, his words or his lack of words were as intriguing as the story of the Vimana itself.
People with deep knowledge, Edward Teller, Henry Monteith, and it turns out that they also have an intense interest in the past and what may have happened in the past. Now, you go through so many fascinating things here. I was just riveted, frankly, by this because these are subjects that we all are fascinated with. Was there a past civilization or was there not? And it looks as if you're right. I mean, that certainly somebody behind the scenes knows something, a lot maybe, and is looking for more. Tell us about the pyramids and government explorations. That just blew me away.
Yeah, this is certainly one of the most significant things that I uncovered during the course of writing the book, was that for many years, governments and military agencies have taken a deep interest, not just in the history of the pyramids as such, but in the manner of their construction. Now, one of the more intriguing theories about the pyramids was that they were built via some sort of, what in simplistic terms today we would call anti-gravity or levitation, and these theories about ropes, rollers, pulleys, tree trunks, etc., to lift multi-ton, in some cases hundreds of ton stones. To me at least, it doesn't hold water. The that it can be done that way, never mind elevating them, however many dozens and hundreds of feet in the air, etc. And a number of researchers over the year have dug extensively into these stories because all cultures, whether it's the ancient Egyptians, the people who built Stonehenge, the Maya, the Inca, they all have stories suggesting that, and obviously this is in folkloric terms, but they talked about how the stones were sort of magically floated into place, without the benefit of any actual particular technology. And they also talk about the stones being moved by magical music or to the sound of a musical instrument or to a magical flute, which kind of sounds strange, but if we take it literally. But what they're talking about is massive stones being raised by acoustics, by sound. And this is basically something the military has been secretly researching for years, acoustic levitation. And it's basically, in as simple terms as you can describe it, it's when you have two opposing sound frequencies with interfering sound waves that create what's called a resonance zone. And within that resonance zone, levitation can occur. And the military has actually achieved levitation in one of these acoustic resonance zones of small objects. But when you look back at these ancient stories, it's clear, to me at least, that they're talking about something very much like this, a resonance zone-driven acoustic technology to raise and maneuver massive blocks, which otherwise, using brute force just would not work. One of the things I found was that files had been opened on a number of people in the UFO research field who'd been looking into these very issues. One of them being a man in the 1950s named Morris Jessup. Jessup wrote a very good book called The Case for the UFO. He had a deep interest in UFOs, but he was also someone who was very well traveled in South America, Central America, and Mexico, and came back fully convinced that these vast formations could only have been built with the benefit of something like anti-gravity. And what was interesting is that the U.S. military got hold of his book and actually took a great interest in these theories and ideas to the extent that they actually invited him out to D.C., paid for his airline flight, his hotel room meals, etc., and kind of had like a behind-the-scenes, semi-official interview with him, /grilling, /interrogation about his research. What was more intriguing is that the people who were doing the interviewing were attached to like an advanced science, advanced weapons program. And I think this sort of gets to the heart of why the military is so interested in many of these ancient mysteries, because they clearly understand, I think, that there were highly advanced technologies in the past that we seem to have lost or forgotten about today or relegated to the world of mythology, and they dearly want to uncover them or resurrect them and try and weaponize the past, if you like, for the present and the future.
Well, it obviously, whatever happened in the past, it was unfortunate. In fact, Morris Jessup's a very interesting figure, folks. Morris Jessup died quite mysteriously. His UFO books hadn't been selling. He was broke. He called J. Manson Valentine, and I believe, what was it? Nick, do you know this story?
Yes, I do. Yeah,
go ahead and tell us about it then.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an interesting story and with sinister overtones. I mean, Jessup, he was an established author. He'd wrote a number of books, and they had been selling well for a while, and then the book started to trail off. The publisher wasn't interested anymore. His wife divorced him, which I guess, when you combine all those factors, it's probably enough to put anybody in a bit of a depression. But, there was never really any sort of deep, real, solid inference that he was on the verge of suicide. Now, actually, ironically, the very day before he died, he contacted a friend of his, Manson Valentine, as you noted, and said that he'd made a significant breakthrough with regard to the Philadelphia experiment. And Jessup came to believe that that the whole Philadelphia experiment, the technology involved, was possibly also something that the ancients had harnessed as well. And so he phoned Valentine up, very sort of galvanized and enthused and excited about the fact that, he'd uncovered something highly significant and wanted to have a meeting with Valentine at the earliest opportunity. But what happened was that actually didn't take place. What did happen was that on that same following day, Jessup was found dead in his car in a Florida park with a hose pipe, I should say, going from the exhaust to the driver's side front window. And of course, he died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, it's one of these sort of grey areas where some people have said, well, he was depressed, etc., etc. Maybe. But that kind of flies in the face of his attitude and stance 24 hours before his death. And if we look at the bigger picture, that he was digging into areas that the military was deeply interested in and was determined to keep under wraps, you have to wonder if there's a bigger story there that we still haven't sort of fully got to the bottom of.
You have to wonder in a lot of these cases if there isn't a bigger story. And if there's anyone who's likely to get to the bottom of these one of these days, it's Nick Redfern. Nick's website is nickredfern.com. I believe you also have a blog on...
Yeah, people can contact me. I have two blogs, nickredfernsbooks.blogspot.com and nickredfern14.blogspot.com.
And we've got two books here, Top Secret, The Pyramids and the Pentagon, which we're discussing now, and Keep Out, Top Secret Places Governments Do Not Want Us to Enter or even know about. We're going to go, when we come back, with Nick Redfern to a place that curiosity has taken us, Mars. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. This is the Edge of the World.
We're talking to Nick Redfern, his website, nickredfern.com, R-E-D-F-E-R-N, nickredfern.com. His book that we're talking about today, Top Secret, The Pyramids and the Pentagon. Nick, years and years ago, I was presented with the original Viking photograph of Cydonia and saw immediately, as anyone with any eyes could see, that a face was looking up at me. Mm-hmm. I financed the work when back in those dear dead days when I could still afford to do such things, the work of Mark Carlotto and Brian O'Leary it turned out to be the only peer-reviewed in the scientific press study of the Mars face that had been done. Now, the Mars face in a Viking because of an orbiter overflight looking directly down at it was poo-pooed from the beginning by NASA, and that one photograph was shown to be to the media and claimed that proved it was just a pile of rocks of no significance whatsoever. Not quite true, is it?
Well, no, it's not. I mean, the NASA's stance on it is that the face on Mars is basically what's known as pareidolia, and that's, the eye seeing random images and making some sort of sense of them, like faces in clouds. Now, that does happen from time to time, of course. Everybody's done that. However, if you look at the face, even some of the pictures that, the more recent ones that don't look quite as impressive, if you kind of squint at them, you still clearly see what looks like a face, albeit one that's sort of been weathered and pulverized over time. And, I think it's important to remember that when people say, well, it looks badly damaged, even within the Face on Mars research community, many of the researchers, have postulated a time frame not of, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago like the Egyptian pyramids or whatever, but they're talking, maybe hundreds of thousands of years old. So it wouldn't be a surprise at all that, we would have a situation where it did look pummeled, over time. But what I think's equally intriguing is that, in the area of Cydonia where you have the face on Mars, we also have these curious pyramid-type structures, which, they look very, very much like the Egyptian pyramids. And, of course, when you have a pyramid-type structure in the same sort of area as something that many people have suggested looks like the Egyptian Sphinx, then that inevitably opens up an entirely different or an additional can of worms, the idea of, is there some sort of Mars-Egypt connection? And, does the government know something about this? Are there ancient secrets to be uncovered relative to Mars and, the possibility of an ancient civilization on there that may have visited the Earth in the distant past.
And, there's also a single photograph of from one of the Mars rovers of what appears to be an individual jumping off a rock on Mars that was immediately poo-pooed on badastronomy.com. But, and they said that if you looked at it in stereo, it was a stereo photograph, you'd see immediately that it was just a rock. So I looked at it in stereo. I had a pair of the glasses. I still do. Did I see that it was a rock? No, it looked even more like a person. But here's the thing. It was a very unusual feature, even geologically, because it's in stone that is red and obviously iron oxide, and the image, the object, is completely different. It's totally black. Now, why not take more images of that object? In fact, if they did, they never released them. Would it have been because it wasn't there anymore? That's what I think. Mm-hmm. I think there may still be somebody on Mars.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to agree with you because, I mean, there are a lot of photographs, even the ones that, possibly sort of slip by the censors, so to speak, that offer us a lot of evidence, intriguing evidence of anomalies on Mars. I mean, certainly one of the most controversial, but for me, compelling ones is the so-called banyan trees, B-A-N-Y-A-N. If you do a search engine on banyan tree plus Mars, you'll see these photographs, what look to all the world like as if somebody was flying high over the Arizona desert in a helicopter, photographing random bushes and trees, etc., on the desert floor. That's literally how they look. It looks like rich, lush vegetation, but of a very much alien type, if you like. It kind of looks different to our trees, as you would imagine it would. But that's exactly what they look like. And, there have been a lot of other anomalies in different areas. People have suggested face-like structures elsewhere. But for me, I think the most significant thing of all is one that a lot of people forget the significance of. And that's the fact that the face looks like a human face. If it was built by indigenous Martians who looked nothing like us and there was no connection, why not make it look definitively alien? It doesn't. It actually looks very close to us. So again, was that done deliberately for the day when we had the ability to travel to Mars and we're confronted by this sort of human-looking face? Was that the whole point all along, to wait for space travelers to come along from here?
Right.
To see what's there.
Sort of like the monolith in 2001.
Yeah, a very similar scenario, yeah.
Yeah. Now, there is also another very similar scenario that you point out in the book that really got me thinking, and that is the similarities between what we find at Cydonia and what we find in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this has obviously inevitably given rise to the idea that, did a Martian culture visit the Earth, or possibly if the Martian atmosphere degraded, and certainly, Mars is a harsh environment, but I don't rule out, as I mentioned, the possibility that there could still be some life there. So, in that sense, the theory that the Martians may have visited here, if you like, I think is an intriguing one because
or we may be the Martians in the sense that, if we had aircraft like the Vimana aircraft, what would have been to stop us from having an interplanetary society? Maybe what we are, folks, is the remnant of a great civilization that destroyed itself in a conflagration so intense that we have, as Nick pointed out very early in the program, almost an inner awareness of its existence, and we live in a state of traumatic amnesia. Nick Redfern, I'd like to thank you for being with us on Dreamland.
Well, thanks, Whitley.
Nick Redfern's website, nickredfern.com, his books, The Pyramids and the Pentagon.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland. This is the Edge of the World.